Welcome to chapter 7. We're going to be talking about percent in this chapter. So, the very first thing we have to do is to define what percent is. So, you may be familiar, but percent literally means out of 100. And that's going to be crucial for us because everything we do is going to be based on 100 when it comes to percents. So, let's have a look. This first example, write each percent as a fraction with the denominator of 100. So 33% literally means 33 out of 100. 6% means 6 out of 100. And so 160% means 160, but still out of 100 because it's percent. So we will reduce these fractions here shortly, just not right now. So here's a task. Now that we can convert percents to fractions, can we convert percents to decimal? So one thing we can do is we can first convert it to a fraction. So 35.2% is 35.2. We take the number, and percent, this symbol right here, this percent, literally has the slash mark for the 1 and the 2 zeros in it. So it's literally 100. So 35.2 out of 100. Now, this is an intermediate step because we can't leave a decimal inside of a fraction. So we have to do the division here. And when we do, we see that it's 0.352. And so to convert from a percent to a decimal, what you can do is first write it as a fraction. So write it out of 100. Then you can write it, then you can do the division and write it as a decimal. Now, you may notice that the relationship to go right from percent to decimal is that you can take the decimal point and move it 2 spaces to the left. So you can take a number, 35.2%. You can take this decimal and move it 2 spaces to the left. So the number is going to be 0.352. And now we can drop the percent symbol because we moved the decimal 2 to the left. But we should add a 0 so that we know that this is indeed a decimal point and that this number starts in the tenths place and not in the ones place. So you can take this shortcut, this rule here, as the book calls it, right? Where you drop the percent symbol and you move the decimal 2 places to the left. Or you can remember that percent means out of 100. You can write it as a fraction, then do your division. So now let's look at some different examples. 37%. To write this as a decimal, we have a couple of options. We can put it over 100 and then do the division. But what would it be to be 37 over 100? Well, that is 37 hundredths. And so hopefully that relationship is still strong between decimals and fractions, and now we're including percents. So 37% means 37 out of 100, which means 37 hundredths. So let's have a look at another one. Let's have a look at D. 0.8%. So this is very, very small. So this is 0.8 out of 100. And when we do the division, it's like moving the decimal point 2 places to the left, and then we add any zeros we need to clarify the place value. So to convert from decimal to percent, right, to go the other way, what we'll do is we will, instead of divide by 100, we'll essentially multiply by 100. So what we'll do is we'll take, let's have a look at this first example here. 27 hundredths. What we'll do is we'll multiply it by 100. That's the percent symbol right there, is the times 100. We'll multiply this by 100, so 0.27 times 100 is 27. And then we have to add the percent symbol to indicate that we've multiplied by 100, to show it's out of 100. Now, the other thing you can do is, what the book says here as a rule, is you can add a percent symbol and move the decimal 2 places to the right. And so we'll practice that here. Let's practice that with C. 0.5. So what I can do is take my decimal and move it 2 places to the right, add a 0 where I need it, and add my percent symbol. So I'll clean this up. 50%. And it makes sense. Oh yeah, 0.5 is a half, and 50% is half of your effort, if 100% is everything. Now let's look at E. 3. What would 3 be as a percentage? Well, remember that we have to take this and we have to multiply by 100. 3 times 100, 300%. So if 1 is 100%, then 3 is 300%. So hopefully that clears up how to go from decimal to percent. You've got a couple of options. You can multiply by 100 and add the percent symbol, or you can remember to move the decimal 2 places to the right. Now, what about going from percent to fraction? Well, remember that's pretty straightforward because percents are out of 100. But what we should always be in the habit of doing is reducing our fractions whenever possible to their lowest terms. So let's have a look here. We won't do all of these, but let's have a look at a couple of them. So if we look at student income, what percentage of college expenses are paid for by student income? That's 16%. That's pretty interesting. So 16% as a fraction would be 16 out of 100. But we also need to reduce. And so 16 and 100, what do they have in common? Both are divisible by 4. 16 divided by 4 is 4, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. And that's as small as it gets. So 4 over 25 is the reduced fraction form of 16%. So it's very straightforward to go from percent to fraction out of 100, but then we always have to be mindful of reducing whenever possible. Now have a look at loans. Loans make up 24%, which is a higher fraction than, or a higher percentage as well, than student income. In fact, it's higher than grants and scholarships even, just by a little bit. So 24% as a fraction. Well, I have to take this intermediate step where I have to write the percent as a fraction out of 100. Then I can divide 24 and 100. For sure, 2 goes in. So let's start with that. 24 divided by 2 is 12. 100 divided by 2 is 50. Those are both still even, so 2 will go in again. 12 divided by 2 is 6. 50 divided by 2 is 25. And that looks like as small as it goes. So that's the reduced form of 24% as a fraction. All right, here's a problem. Suppose the price your bookstore pays for your textbook is 7/10 of the price you pay for your textbook. Write 7/10 as a percent. So if we want to write 7/10 as a percent, we have a couple of options. One thing we can do is just multiply by 100, right? We can take 7/10 and we can multiply it by 100, which is, of course, 100 over 1. Now I could reduce here a little bit. 10 goes into 10 once and into 100 10 times. So 7 times 10 is 70. And I have ones on the bottom, so I don't need them. But to show that I multiply by 100, I need to add the percent symbol. So I can multiply by 100. Now, if I don't want to deal with the fraction, what I could do with that 7/10 is I could divide. So 10 doesn't go into 7, of course, but it does go into 70 7 times with no remainder. So 0.7 is the decimal equivalent of 7/10. And then what I could do is I could move this decimal 1, 2 places to the right and add any zeros and my percent symbol to show, 70%. Okay, so I could have gotten it that way too. How about this one? Change 3/8 to a percent. So to go from fraction to percent, all we have to do is divide. So we have to take our 3/8 and we actually have to divide. Other way around. Well, 8 won't go into 3. That's the problem. That's why it's a fraction. But it will go into 30 3 times, because 3/8 is 24. With 6 left over. Let me keep adding zeros and see if I can get this to go in evenly. 8 goes into 67 times, because 7/8 is 56. With 4 left over, add another 0, bring it down. 8 does go into 40 evenly 5 times. 5/8 is 40. So 0.375 is the decimal equivalent of 3/8. Now, to turn it into a percentage, I have to multiply by 100, or I can take the decimal and move it 2 places to the right and add a percent symbol to show that I multiplied by 100, that it's a percentage. So to go from fraction to percent, here's the rule, as the book likes to say. You can write the fraction as a decimal and then change decimal to percent, or you can write the fraction as an equivalent fraction with the denominator of 100, drop the 100, and use the percent symbol. I think what makes the most sense in most instances is to divide and get the decimal, and then turn it into a percent. So some common fractions here: 1/2 as a decimal is 0.5, and as a percent is 50%. How about 1/3? As a decimal, it turns out to be a repeating decimal, 0.3 repeating. And so as a percent, at some point we have to round it. And so we'll round it. We can write it like this, or we may choose at some point to write it like this, although I think the fractional version is preferred typically. Coming over here, let's look at something like 3/5. 3/5. If you divide that, you get 0.6. And so if you turn that into a percent by multiplying by 100 or moving the decimal 2 places to the right, you get 60%. And then if you have 1/1 or a whole, right, could be written like that. As a decimal, it's 1 or 1.0, and as a percent, it's 100, because 1 whole is 100%. 100 out of 100. So let's summarize the key concepts here. What is the relationship between the word percent and the number 100? Well, cent means 100, so percent means out of 100. B. Explain in words how you would change 25% to a decimal. Well, you have a couple of options, and so you may do something different than what I do. What I would do to go from 25% to a decimal is I would drop the percent symbol, and I would move the decimal point, which exists right at the end of a number. It exists right here. If you don't see it, right, it's at the far right of the number after the ones place. I'd drop the percent symbol, and I'd move my decimal 2 places to the left. C. Explain in words how you would change 25% to a fraction. I would take the number 25 and put it over 100. Then I would reduce, of course, to lowest terms. And 25% is one that I know as a quarter. D. After reading this section, you know that 1/2, 0.5, and 50% are equivalent. Show mathematically why this is true. Well, you've got a couple of options. You could say, well, 50% is 50 out of 100. And then if you reduce this, you do get 1/2. So that's true. Then if you take 1/2 and you divide it, you end up with 0.5. So if you divide the fraction, you get the decimal. If you turn the percent into out of 100 and reduce, you get the fraction. So hopefully you see how fractions, decimals, percents are all connected. They're all 3 different ways of expressing the same information, and that will hopefully get you started on 7.1, and we'll see you in 7.2.